The following is a special presentation, The Remaking of America's Constitution, a conversation from the 2025 Annual Celebration of the Humanities.
Akil, it's a pleasure to have you here in New Hampshire. What a treat.
Thank
so
you.
Happy to sit down
Thank
with
you.
you. Well, as Dean Carpenter said, this book is the follow-up to your earlier book, which covers the nation's founding, called The Words That Made Us. So Born Equal, as has been said, covers 1840 to 1920. Just remind us, Akil, of the dramatic changes that occurred over those just 80 years. I mean, it's breathtaking, really, when you consider what happened over less than a century.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. You just heard reference to the West Wing TV show about a fictional New Hampshire governor who descends from someone who signed the Declaration of Independence, Josiah Bartlett. So in Volume 1, The Words That Made Us, I try to tell the story of how we become a we. Us is as in we the people. Us is as in the U.S. So this is what I hope to be a 3-volume trilogy of the American constitutional experience. So in the first 80 years, 1760 to 1840, we become a we. New Hampshire unites with Massachusetts and Virginia, and New York and South Carolina. These formerly separate colonies come together. And first loosely and then more tightly, and they wage a war of revolution, of independence. They adopt a Declaration of Independence, eventually Articles of Confederation, an indivisible Constitution, a Bill of Rights. That's a lot, but they don't have that much in common because the North is increasingly anti-slavery and the Deep South sees things differently. So in 1840, when this book begins, America is deeply divided. Maybe not half slave and half free, but still partly slave and partly free. And women don't vote anywhere. And so that's 1840. And by 1920, slavery is abolished everywhere. That's the 13th Amendment. And birthright citizenship, black and white, male and female, is proclaimed across the land. Equal birthright citizenship. Blacks in the 15th Amendment are promised that even though they're born with darker skin, they're going to have political equality. And by the end of this period, 1920, the same promise is going to be made to people who happen to be born female rather than male. So the big theme of this 80-year period is birth equality. The big theme of the first 80 years is union.
It really is amazing. I mean, as you put it, Akil, the era began with millions of Black Americans groaning in chains. It ends with millions of women winning the vote. There's just so much that happens in that short time period. And I wonder, what do you think is underappreciated about this era by the general public or even scholars? I mean, I myself, when I think about that period, I think, okay, the Civil War, but I don't think much beyond that. So what do you think most people don't appreciate about all that changed during this time?
One thing they may not fully appreciate is how it's not just about race, it's about gender, it's about sex. Many people think of the Civil War Amendment trilogy, the 13th, 14th, 15th. I'm in effect trying to say it's a tetralogy. Let's actually add the 19th, which is women's suffrage. It comes about decades later, but it is also, in effect, a Lincolnian amendment. It's an amendment inspired by Lincoln's vision above all, that we're all created equal, and born equal, not just black and white, but male and female. And he's not the only character in the book. And indeed, one thing about this book that wasn't true of the last one is I have more leading women in this story. The last book, yeah, Abigail Adams is there, and she's off stage just a bit. She's not center stage. But in this book, at least I have 4 lead characters in these 80 years, and 2 of the 4 are women. In the first book, I had 6 lead characters. They're the 6, the big 6, the 6 founders. Your first 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and your 2 geniuses, Franklin and Hamilton. And that's by acclamation. Everyone says those are the big 6, but they're all men. This period, also 80 years, I have 4 characters that tell the story, or whose story I try to tell, and 2 of them are women, and 1 is non-white. One of the men is non-white. So that's and people may not understand Civil War was about black and white and slave and free. They may not understand actually that the issues of women's equality were front and center.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I learned so much reading this book. And let's talk about those 4 characters, because as you just said, they are not cut from the same cloth as your lead characters in your first book, who are those highly educated, mostly wealthy white men who wrote our founding documents. The stars of this new book, and I just love the way you write about them, they show how much America has changed since the founding. So who are the heroes and heroines of Born Equal, and how are they just so different from the leaders of your first book?
And in this one, I'm on the first name basis with them. It's a more informal era. No one would call General Washington George, and he was Mr. Jefferson. Maybe you might say Ben Franklin. But when he was very homespun and could be very informal when he wanted to be, he was actually Dr. Franklin. But in this one, I'm on a first name basis with my characters. I'm trying to introduce them to you. So, of course, towering above all is Abe, and he has less than a year's formal education in his whole life. Now, I'm not talking about college, law school. I'm talking about classroom education. Less than a year. They're all low born. And then there's Frederick Douglass, and he's born a slave. He doesn't ever even know his birth date. You have pets, you have dogs and cats and horses, and you remember their birth dates. He never knows his birth date. He doesn't know who his father was. It's hard to imagine someone born lower and who rises higher over the course of his lifetime. And then there are 2 women who are front and center, and it's at their birth, no one would have predicted that they are going to be the leading characters. And one is Elizabeth Cady, as she is in the first sentence of chapter 1. By the end of that first paragraph, she becomes Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She gets married, and she refuses in this first paragraph to utter the words obey in her wedding vow because she thinks she's entering into an equal relationship. And I was backstage and I was hearing a little bit of a story of a married couple, and there's something actually kind of interesting. Maybe I misheard, but in Elizabeth Cady and her relationship to Henry Brewster Stanton, something kind of happens in chapter 1 that's somewhat reminiscent of, I guess, of something that happened here in New Hampshire in your lifetime. The 4th character you might not guess. So I claim that this 4th character is America's first female superstar, first leading lady. Everyone's talking about her in a way that they weren't all talking about Abigail Adams. She's off stage, but I'm saying before there was Taylor Swift, and before there was Beyonce or Kamala Harris or Hillary Rodham Clinton or Eleanor Roosevelt, there was Harriet Beecher Stowe from New England, and she sells millions of copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her book sells more copies than Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, Scarlet Letter, Moby Dick, than any book by any American in the whole century. And she's writing about slavery, and she's writing about slave women and slave children, and not just slave men. And wow, she's important, and we've kind of forgotten about her.
Yeah, I really appreciate that about the book. I mean, obviously, I've heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe, but you are a huge admirer of hers with all of these characters, too. I have to ask you this, Akil. I know you've been asked before. You call them Harriet, Abe, Frederick, and Elizabeth, and I find it very charming, but why did you choose to do that?
Oh, and some people hate it. that since we had the dean of the University of New Hampshire Law School introduce us, thank you, Megan, it was the Franklin Pierce School of Law at a certain point. And Abe, very famously, actually, in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, refers to these conspirators that he says are kind of arrayed against him. And he calls them by their first name, Roger, James, Franklin, and Stephen. And he means, Roger Taney and James Buchanan and Franklin Pierce and Stephen Douglas. So, and he's Father Abraham, but he's also Honest Abe. Okay, so and in ways that, again, in an earlier period, it was a more formal period, but also I came to feel connected to them. I want the reader to feel connected to them, and people call him Abe, and he's born Abe, and he doesn't reject that that label. So I went with it, and you see, if I use last names, that's rather patriarchal, truthfully, okay, because it's the last name you inherit it from your father and not your mother. And I'm talking about an era where women are important as well as men. So there are two Stantons. There's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and there's Henry Brewster Stanton. So if I use last names, it was going to be a little more complicated. Oh, and slaves, they're often called by their first name. So why shouldn't we call free people by their first name? And some people will hate my choice, but that was why I chose.
Yeah, I read your justification for that. I think it's a great choice. I think it works, especially when you understand why you did it. Did you have to fight with your publisher for that?
No, not my publisher, but some of my friends who read the book in manuscript and who have relied on in previous books and who have given me generally good advice. And I violated one of my own rules. Usually when at least two people both don't like something, I pull it out, my two-person rule. But this one I didn't, because other people said, oh, go with it.
Well, it makes sense. The way you explain it, it makes sense. And I wonder, Akil, how you see it possible for these four characters to become leaders in this new era. What changes were happening in our society, what stars were aligning that provided that opening for these four, low-born, self-made people to become some of our greatest leaders.
Yeah, so it's proverbially, the book begins sort of at the end of Jacksonian America, in which property qualifications are dropping away. It's perceived as a more egalitarian, democratic society, more open to even amateurs, folks of all sorts. This is Tocqueville's America. It's seen as more flat, more level. Western expansion, and some of the bigger property holdings are being divided up among the children, and so and people are moving out west, and there's a lot of upward mobility. I highlight the woman angle as well, especially by the time at the very end of this period, 1920. So I actually ask, first, why do women get the vote, and why so much later than men? And I have a whole bunch of hypotheses, but here's just one of them. It's just very dramatic. So infant mortality drops dramatically. In 1850, 40% of children born alive will not see their fifth birthday.
Wow.
And by 1920, it's dropped in half. Now, what that means is that women won't have to have as many children. And childbearing is actually also quite risky. So women are going to have longer life expectancies. Their lives are going to be more like men because they're not popping out as many children. Harriet writes not just as a woman, but as a mother. And she writes about mothers like Eliza Harris, not just men like Uncle Tom. And she has lost a child, and she writes about that. Jane Austen, whom I adore and who features in the book, this is the 250th anniversary of her birth, she writes simply as a lady. We don't know her name in her lifetime. And Louisa May Alcott from this part of the world actually writes under androgynous pseudonyms, and the The Bronte sisters actually write under male pseudonyms: Currier, Acton, Ellis Bell, not as Elizabeth Bronte or Charlotte Bronte, George Sand, George Eliot. So Harriet is out there as a woman, as a mother. Most of those people that I just mentioned actually never bore a child. She did. She knows what it's like to lose a child. And so she has a certain empathy for slave women whose children are being ripped away from them. But there are a lot of things that are happening. I'll give you one other example. I told you about just changing in infant mortality. Here's another thing that happens. People move out west.
That makes a big difference because the sort of old structures, the old families, the Adams families, the Jeffersons, all those old established families don't have the pull and the sway in these new territories.
Everyone's the same.
Anybody can be,
Everyone's the same. Stephen Douglas is a transplant. Abe is actually Kentucky born, then moves to Indiana, then to Illinois, and it's such a young society. So there's that. But especially also now when gold is discovered in California, and people move out west, the men tend to go first. And what this is going to mean, and I actually give you statistics on this, women's suffrage comes first in the West. Colorado, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho. Comes first bluntly in the places where there are no women. See, because who has to vote for women's suffrage? People already vote. They're all male. At a certain point at time T0, no women is voting anywhere. They can't vote themselves the vote. So the men are going to have to vote them the vote, and the men are going to vote them the vote where there are no women, because the men are actually desperate. And in Wyoming, for example, I give you the data. Wyoming has 6 white men for every white woman in 1870, when as a territory, it gives women the vote. And of the first of the 9 most gender imbalanced territories or states in 1890, the ones that have the biggest differential between men and women, of the 9 most gender imbalanced states, every one of those 9 is going to become one of the first 11 women's suffrage states. That correlation is higher than smoking and cancer. You don't see this kind of correlation actually in the social sciences. But here's the thing. You won't find that statistic in any other book.
Yeah. Another thing that's going on at the time, territorial expansion, imbalanced gender ratios. You also described that Americans are living in an era of incredible mass communication, Akil, especially just an amazingly robust newspaper and magazine industry. So how do these 4, again, low-born, self-made Americans use this rich tapestry that we have of magazines and newspapers and pamphlets and so forth? How do they use that to become leaders?
So Abe basically, again, he has less than a year's classroom education in his life, and he reads and reads and reads. And he reads books, true, and he loves Aesop's Fables, and he loves Euclid. Oh, he's really into logic, and he knows his Bible. And so Aesop's Fables, Shakespeare, some classics. But he also prodigiously reads newspapers. And actually, as a young person, he starts writing for newspapers anonymously at first. So, and that was true of a young Alexander Hamilton. And Ben Franklin is, of course, a newspaper publisher. This is a newspaper culture, and they're interactive. I heard earlier, I was backstage, but I heard about conversation and people talking to each other back and forth. The newspapers were a medium for that. Let's take, and when you have the telegraph, the Lincoln-Douglas debates can be stenographically recorded and immediately, like at literally the speed of light, being sent to all parts of the country. The entire country is listening in on a bunch of constitutional law debates between 2 lawyers. So it's a telegraph, and it's a newspaper culture. But let's take Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'll give you all 4 very quickly. She publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin it's a serialized thing, and it's published, in installments in a newspaper, just like Dickens did. But he wasn't doing it politically. Hers was in a political newspaper, an slavery newspaper. Frederick Douglass is a newspaper publisher, and he has several newspapers of his own. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually knows how to get attention in the newspaper. She's brilliant at memes. So she basically takes the Declaration of Independence and she riffs on it at Seneca Falls. And she comes up with a document that the newspapers reprint. And here's a key sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And the newspapers find this very interesting. She knows how to grab attention in petitions also, which are reprinted in newspapers. It's that kind of culture.
All four of these people are very good they're very good writers, they're very good communicators, and they use these new lightning fast tools to get their message out, and it has a huge impact. Let's talk about Abraham Lincoln, or Abe. He's the hero of this book, of course, a revered president, the subject of hundreds of books. What do you think, Akil, your book adds to our portrait of Lincoln? What different insights do you hope to offer?
So as of a few years ago, they actually did a study, I think 18,000 books on Lincoln in English alone.
Wow.
And the only figures that have nearly that amount would be Jesus and Hitler and maybe Napoleon. So I grew up loving Lincoln, and I became very close to him. In this book, I read lots of stuff about him and by him, and I know his flaws, and I try to be honest and show you the warts and all. He's greater than I ever even imagined, greater than you might think. I think no country has ever produced and then picked as its supreme leader anyone better than Abe or close to Abe. So you'll have to read the book yourself and decide that. But here's how I begin, and I'm relentless in this theme, that he is a lawyer, and he's a constitutional lawyer, and he's an originalist, meaning he cares about what the founders said and thought, what they originally were trying to do, and he will be faithful to that even when he doesn't like it. He doesn't like the fugitive slave law. He thinks slavery is evil. He once says, he uses the word hate. He says, I hate it. He says, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember a time I did not so think and feel. It's visceral to him. And yet, he tells the world in his first inaugural address, I will enforce the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution because it's in the Constitution. I don't like the 3/5 clause. It gives extra clout for states that have slaves. This is a bad thing, but it's in the Constitution. We can change the Constitution if we think it's wrong. And he's going to, in the end, lead a crusade and create a party that will change the Constitution 3 times, 13, 14, 15. And eventually, I claim the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, is a reverberation of that. He's a lawyer. He's an originalist lawyer who cares about what the founders said. And it's there in plain sight in front of your eyes and your ears. If you hear his words, I'll just repeat them to you. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's Gettysburg. That's 1863, November. And he's saying 87 years early, 420, 80 in French. 87 years ago, it's more poetic to say 40. You do the math, 1863 minus 87, that's 1776. That's not the Constitution, that's the Declaration. But he's making an original argument. In his audience, no one can remember what happened. Is there anyone here who can remember personally what happened 87 years ago? You'd have to be 93 and have a great memory. Okay? So he's saying our father. So he's identifying with the founding fathers, brought forth upon this continent. He thinks geographically, geostrategically, brought forth on this continent a new nation, a new thing in the world, conceived in liberty, not slavery. He says slavery wasn't the essence, even though there was slavery everywhere in 1776, even in New Hampshire. But that's not the essence. Conceived in liberty, he says, and dedicated. He's saying, here's the key. And it's a contested proposition. He says the key to the whole thing is that all men are created equal. which is not how Roger Taney thinks about it. It's not how Stephen Douglas thinks about it. Or if they say all men are created equal, they say, oh, that doesn't mean black men. Oh, that doesn't mean this. That doesn't mean that. So you asked me what the big news is about Abe that they don't know before. They don't know that he's an originalist because many of them think only conservatives are originalist. And he is not a total conservative. He's a reformer, but he's an originalist. I identify with that. I'm left of center, but I really believe in the Constitution.
We actually have some questions from our audience that came in before, and one that relates exactly to what you just said, Akil. And I have read not thousands of books on Lincoln, but I have read many, and there's a lot new in here. Again, you show Lincoln as a constitutional scholar, a lawyer, someone dedicated to these founding documents, but dedicated to making them better,
yes.
If I could go so far as to say that.
Yes.
So this person asks, you point out that Lincoln at Gettysburg purposely chose the Declaration of Independence, as you just said, over the Constitution as a founding document to counter the argument that the United States was founded on slavery, as you just said. This person says, comment on Lincoln's choice, and given the Constitution's allowance of the slave trade, why isn't it correct that we were founded on slavery? And thank you to that person for that question. Go ahead, Akil.
It's a brilliant question. And Lincoln says, look, if you just wanted to declare independence, you didn't have to have this document. In fact, on July 2nd, 1776, they declare their independence. And here's the key sentence. These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, which can wage war and make peace and conclude treaties and all the rest. Done. Why would you actually have this longer document? To give reasons. To whom? To each other, to Americans, here's what we're fighting for, to the decent people of the world whom we want on our side, submitting facts to a candid world, but also ultimately to the soldiers, so they know what they're fighting for, to the Almighty, the Supreme Judge of the universe. There's going to be a war, okay? And we are appealing to the Supreme Judge of the universe for the rectitude of our intentions, and the God of war will decide the outcome of this, and we want to get on, and this is how New Hampshire people think, New Englanders think. We want to have God on our side, and we won't have God on our side unless we acknowledge that slavery is wrong. And we put it in there. We're not getting rid of it immediately. We are not. We're not agreeing to that. But we are agreeing that all men, all human beings are equal in God's eyes. No one's born a slave. No one's born a slave master. And eventually, the implicit principle, says Lincoln, this is contested, is that we're going to have to eventually get rid of it. Now, I want to say one more thing because I'm in New Hampshire, because you guys don't even know this. So there's slavery in the world way before 1619, everywhere in the world. Okay, so 1619 is nothing new. And I know what color skin I have, okay? So I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying Asians had slavery and Africans had slavery among themselves, and so did Native Americans. That's not news that when slavery comes to the New World. And the idea of freeing slaves is not new. It's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. Charlton Heston in Ben-Hur gets his freedom. Zero Mostel, in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way of the Forum, gets his freedom, drama, comedy. Freeing slavery is not new. Freeing slaves is not new. Here's what's new. Ending slavery. Abolition, not emancipation, not manumission. Ending slavery, and that's an American idea. It's born, the world's first anti-slavery society is born in 1775 in Philadelphia. And its leaders are going to be Ben Franklin and Benjamin Rush. But what happens immediately thereafter, after 1776? The Pennsylvania Constitution, presided over at a convention by Ben Franklin, says all men are born equally free and independent. And the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 says all men are born free and all men are born free and equal. And that's going to lead to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in the early 1780s. And here's the beginning of another constitution that I read somewhere. It's Article 1 of the New Hampshire Constitution. All men are born equally free, and independent. Okay? And that's going to be the basis of eliminating slavery in this state.
And it's very early. All these state constitutions are very early.
The northern states got rid of slavery from the beginning, and Lincoln emphasizes this, okay? Abolition comes to the world in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire and other places, and South Carolina doesn't follow suit, so that's why you're going to, in the end, have to have a civil war. But Lincoln is saying, here's what's new in 1776. Abolition. They actually identified a North Star. All men are created equal, and immediately, at least people in the North moved in that direction. They got rid of slavery. You mentioned the slave trade. As soon as the Constitution permitted the abolition of the slave trade in 1808, we got rid of it. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the Northwest in 1787, and indeed Congress, in the Constitution, one of the first statutes George Washington signs, codifies all this. This is Lincoln's argument. It's contested, but if you want to see it for your own eyes, with your own eyes tonight, go home with the Google machine, just look up the Cooper Union Address, where he actually lays out his argument. Wow, he sounds in his method like Clarence Thomas or Robert Bork or Ed Meese, but my claim is, and Bork was my teacher, and Meese is my friend, and so is Clarence Thomas. I'm left of center, but my claim is, when you read Lincoln, you will see a liberal, an egalitarian, a nationalist making originalist arguments. I locate myself in that tradition. There are others.
Here's another question from the audience, and this gets to this idea of the original language, born equal, created equal. This person asks, you chose the title Born Equal as opposed to Created Equal. Why? What is the significance of the difference in those terms? That's a great question.
Yeah. So here's the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, and it's under assault today. This is the birthright citizenship question. Birthright citizenship, as in born, because it's in the Constitution. The word created, not so much, but born is, and I'm a con law guy. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Where does that come from? It comes from 15 of the 19 northern state constitutions, including the Constitution of this state, which, to repeat, begins. This is the first sentence of your Constitution. All men are born equally free and independent. Now, what does it mean to be born? Lincoln evolves on this. Originally, he thinks it just means that in principle, everyone is born free. That is, no one is born a slave. No one is born a slave master. Here's what that means. We're all children of God, theologically. And if I encounter a mammal in the wilderness, if it's a dog or a cat or a horse, goat, I can capture that mammal. I can tame it. I can make it my own, make it my pet. It's a tameable beast of the field if I encounter it in the wilderness. And it's not owned by anyone else. I can't do that when I encounter a fellow human in the wilderness. I'm not born a master. No one is born a slave. I can't make that person a tameable beast of the field. So we're all born free. That's Lincoln's initial view. And in the Lincoln, and that's true everywhere. It's a mathematical truth. It's universal. It's Euclidean. It's true in a box, with a fox, on a train, in the rain, here and there. It's just true. Okay. Yeah. Seuss is a logician, and he did go to Dartmouth, I think. But Lincoln, in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, says, I'm not in favor of Negro citizenship. And he says, I'm not in favor of Negro voting. He's going to evolve along these axes. And eventually, because blacks fight in the Civil War for their freedom, here's where Frederick Douglass comes in. Lincoln comes to feel that that in America, now this is not universal, they're not just free, the 13th Amendment, equally free, born free, but you should be born an equal citizen, an equal birthright citizenship, black or white, male or female. eventually an equal voter, black or white. That's the 15th Amendment, or male or female. That's going to be the 19th Amendment. Lincoln is dead when all these happen, but they're codifying his vision, which grows as he grows and matures.
We have some more questions that I'll go to in a minute about some of the constitutional aspects of the book. But one of the things that I think makes it really work, Akil, is your constitutional examination, the deep, deep history, but also, as you said a few minutes ago, the 4 characters. And every great book has to have great characters. And let's talk about some of them a little bit more, especially how Lincoln interacted with other key actors in the book. And there were relationships that I did not know about. For example, your book reminds us, as you said earlier, of the enormous importance of Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. You say Harriet Beecher Stowe stands among the most important women in constitutional history. How so? I love that.
Because she is attacking slavery and saying we must get rid of it. And that's going to lead, and that's Lincoln's idea too. And Lincoln, I try to show in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and even before that in Peoria, is riffing on her. And I won't go through, I don't have all the quotes, but it's clear that he has read her book and his audience has read her book, because everyone has read her book. And again and again, he's actually alluding to it. And she has 7 brothers who are all famous, who are all preachers, the most famous of which is Henry Ward Beecher. He would be like the Billy Graham of his period, the most famous preacher in America. And he's the guy that invites Lincoln to give a speech at Cooper Union, in which this, kind of hick from the sticks impresses the city slickers, in New York City. And they actually look at this guy and say, yeah, that guy could be president. And that's Harriet's brother. And when Lincoln issues his Emancipation Proclamation, Harriet actually writes a very important piece in The Atlantic. She's one of the founders of The Atlantic magazine, telling the Brits, the British anti-slavery women, this is not just a war for union, this is a war for freedom, and you should support all of this. When Lincoln meets her, I know some people contest this. I believe they're wrong. I've actually really researched this quite deeply. It's what people are taught, but it also is true. And that's not true of, all the famous sayings. But when Lincoln meets her in the White House, he says, you're the little woman. And that does sound like Lincoln. And everyone looks little to Lincoln. You're the little lady or the little woman who wrote the big book that made this great war.
Right. Yeah, that's an incredible quote. The other thing that I had forgotten about Uncle Tom's Cabin, and talk a little bit about this, please, Akil, is Harriet Beecher Stowe, makes the case against slavery on many levels, including the sexual violence and
rape.
And she really does not hold back there. And then other people start going there, and they start shaming white male slave owners as rapists and people who pull families apart. And she sort of tackles it from that very female family moral aspect. So go ahead, please.
And children are being ripped from their mothers' bosoms. And that's, she tells a story of Eliza clutching her baby Harry and tried to escape together. But yes, Charles Sumner is going to be caned into bloody unconsciousness, almost killed, because he gives a speech, The Crime Against Kansas, in which he says white men are raping black women, and he frankly accuses a fellow senator, Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, of having carnal relations with his slaves. And Harriet goes there first. Frederick Douglass talks about how his sister was stripped and whipped in a sadistic manner, but Harriet is writing as a woman,
right,
as a mother,
and it's very powerful.
Oh my gosh!
And it had a huge impact, and I had forgotten about that. we should talk about Frederick Douglass. Just an unbelievable character. I didn't realize before I read this book, for example, Akil, that Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were friends, and that Douglass gave his voice, his amazing, impressive, powerful voice, to the cause of women's suffrage. So I had no idea. So walk us through that, if you could, please, Akil.
So I was backstage, but I heard a little bit of a story about, two people getting married. And so here's Act 1, Scene 1, Chapter 1. Elizabeth accompanies her husband, Henry, who is an anti-slavery activist, and they go to the world's first anti-slavery convention in London. Okay? That they're on their honeymoon. And these are the most reform-minded people in the world, politicians and journalists and academics and business people. And the first thing the men do is kick out the women. Okay? That's on day one. And Elizabeth is not amused by this. Okay? So that's Elizabeth. And she says to Lucretia Mott, who is a great female crusader, a Quakeress abolitionist from Philadelphia, damn it. Maybe she doesn't say damn it. And she says, when we get back to America, we're going to have our own convention. So this is 1840 London. She's on her honeymoon. 8 years later, Seneca Falls, she does stage her own convention. And she says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And she advocates woman suffrage in 1848. And even Lucretia thinks this is a little edgy, but she has one person who really strongly supports her, coming over from another city in upstate New York. Frederick Douglass, who's already world famous, says she's right. Okay? And so Frederick Douglass lends his support to Elizabeth in 1848. They were friends before. His main patron, the guy who actually will come to fund his magazine, the guy named Garrett Smith, is Elizabeth's first cousin, and he's the richest guy in New York, perhaps. Some say the richest person in America. His real estate holdings are bigger than the state of Rhode Island. And to repeat, he's funding Frederick. Today, he'd be George Soros or something like that. And he almost gets himself indicted, speaking of George Soros. And Douglass almost gets himself indicted because they're both friends of John Brown. But it's a small world. So Garrett Smith is Frederick Douglass's backer, and Garrett Smith is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's first cousin and the closest cousin. And Frederick helps Elizabeth, and Frederick is a huge women's rights crusader for his whole life. The day he dies, he's actually at a women's suffrage convention and sits next to Susan B. Anthony, goes home to have a bite to eat, and has a heart attack. So, all the way, he's a crusader for black rights and civil rights. So, yes, you heard about, it was an informal advice to the West Wing. That's the TV show. That's an ensemble cast, and you have to bring people together in interesting ways. So I got Frederick and Elizabeth. I've got Harriet and Abe. Frederick only meets Abe 3 times, but each time is hugely consequential, and I narrate those meetings.
Well, and I do want to ask you about Frederick and Abe's relationship and how that evolved, but I'm so impressed by Frederick Douglass because, one could say the guy had enough going on. I mean, he had enough struggles, he had enough battles, and yet he loaned his time, his energy, his voice to this cause. It's impressive.
It is. Now, it's complicated because when the Civil War ends, blacks are going to get the vote and women aren't. Black men are going to get the vote and women aren't. And Frederick doesn't love it, but he'll take half a loaf. And Elizabeth is really annoyed that actually she thinks that Frederick is betraying the cause. He's not. He's become over the years just a little bit more savvy, and he's no longer quite the radical he once was. And take the deal now and then try to push for more later.
Well, and that kind of has to do with his relationship with Lincoln, right? I mean, initially he felt Lincoln was too gradual to
Yes.
tentative. So go ahead.
Yes, yes. So initially, he's very much on the outside, but as he comes to wield more influence, he realizes that in politics, you can't get everything you want immediately. What's impressive about Lincoln is not that he's the most advanced politician of his era. He never is the most advanced, but he's always the most advanced politician who has a chance of getting elected. And he always moves in one direction because he knows where the North Star is, okay? And he never actually regresses. And that's Lincoln. And Frederick Douglass comes to see, gee, and Frederick Douglass is so mean to Lincoln in print.
He mean. What does he say?
He says, like, he doesn't really believe in anti-slavery. He's just a horrible white man. Oh, and he can't even write. Like, really? Lincoln can't write? And he says, like, so, and Lincoln knows all of this. And Frederick Douglass just invites himself unannounced to the White House, this former slave, former runaway, almost got himself indicted by Trump. I mean, by Buchanan. So, well, just today, Letitia James and everything. So this guy almost indicted because he was playing footsie with John Brown, a former runaway slave. That was illegal. He's been so nasty to Lincoln, just shows up at the White House unannounced, and Lincoln says, I know who you are. Sit down. I'm delighted to meet you. Thank you for coming. That's the first meeting. And by the third meeting, the second meeting is we have to work together to get Southern Black slaves to leave their plantations and join the Union Army, because that will be the margin of victory.
Right.
And they're working together to do this. And the third meeting is Lincoln's inaugural, his second inaugural, and Douglass crashes the party, shows up, and the guards try to kind of push him away. And he says, tell Lincoln I'm here, tell Lincoln I'm here. And the word kind of filters over to Lincoln and says, let him in. And Lincoln goes and searches him out. And Douglass says, you have other people to talk to. He says, no, you're the person I most want to hear from. There's no one whose opinion I value more than yours, sir. And tell me what you thought of the speech. And Douglass says, it was a sacred effort. And Lincoln said, I'm so glad you liked it. And those are the last words exchanged between America's greatest white man and greatest black man. And I don't know if you know that story, but you'll learn that story and others in the book.
Yeah. And again, that's what, please, applause. I mean, that's what makes the book come to life, I think, is, again, you've got this serious constitutional treatment, you've got the rich history, but you have these people and these moments, and
none of them is
quite beautiful.
Elizabeth is racist and bigoted in all sorts of ways. Abe is the product of his culture, and he will grow over time, but he, he's even he is imperfect in certain ways. I think Harriet Beecher Stowe has just a nobility to her. When she writes to Douglass, she doesn't even know him, but she calls him her brother in Christ. She's the egalitarian, utopian end of the movement. But she can, to her critics, seem very preachy and condescending, looking down, on slave masters. Lincoln is very good at hating the sin but loving the sinner. They're all imperfect in their own ways, but wow, America produced these people once. Can we do it again?
Yeah, and Lincoln doesn't seem like, please. He doesn't seem like someone who holds a grudge.
Not at all. It's really
that's remarkable.
It is. Yes. With malice toward none, charity for all. He's the Civil War, just the massive death. And he suffered death personally, his own son, maybe his favorite son, in the White House. And yet he realizes, he said, we have to bind up the nation's roots. We have to come back together. And so he actually tells Grant, give them easy terms. He says, let them up easy. Let them take their horses back to the farms. Let them keep their guns. They're going to need them, because they're varmints around their critters. They're going to need their guns and their horses when they go back to the farms. So he actually says, let them up easy.
Here's a question from our audience. These are fantastic questions here, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. This person asks, how would Lincoln guide us to bridge the cultural political gap today? It's a tough one, but it's a good one.
Well, we've already begun to talk about it. Lincoln talks to everyone.
And he doesn't hold a grudge.
His best friend is a slaveholder. They shared a bed together. We won't go into the details because it's a different world and it's kind of complicated. But his best friend, Joshua Speed, and he literally, slept together in the same bed for a couple of years. And Speed is an unrepentant slaveholder. He marries into a slaveholding Kentucky family. He's a Southerner. His father's from Virginia and his mother, and he speaks with a drawl. And his favorite song is Dixie. But he's very good at reaching across the aisle. He says, listen, you Southerners, you didn't create slavery. You inherited it. And if we were in your place, we'd probably think the way you do. So he does listen to everyone. He's very good that way. And he is proverbially honest. No one called him Honest Stephen Douglas because he wasn't. He was a liar. I wouldn't buy a used carriage from that man. I wouldn't. Okay? And Roger Taney is not honest. So, America produced this person, was whip smart and honest, and was willing very much to talk with people who hated him.
There's another character who is not one of the top 4 in this book, and you know who I'm going to ask about.
Yeah.
I came away after reading this book with a new, I don't even want to say renewed, new appreciation for John Quincy Adams, whom Akil calls in his book JQA, because that's what we're doing. And oh my goodness, I really came to appreciate John Quincy Adams from reading your book, Akil. One of the points that you make is John Quincy Adams is the only president who touched both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So in a way, John Quincy Adams is the embodiment of the tie between your first book and this one.
Yes, what I'm trying to do, and I need your help. You already ordered the book, and thank you all for that. I need you to read the book, not just have it on your shelf. And you need to read the book because you need to know the story of America. It's what connects us all. Because what we don't have in common as Americans is race or national origin or religion or even first language or politics. Or it's a vast country, north, south, east, west, coast, hinterland. What we have in common is our Constitution and Declaration of Independence and our heroes, really, the story. Our fathers and mothers, so to speak, 77 years ago. That's what we have in common, and we don't know that story. And if we don't, we fly apart. I'm trying to write, as one author, a single continuous story that covers a quarter of a millennium, 1760 to the present, 1760 to 1840, 1840 to 1920, and then 1920 to the current moment. Because I'm doing that, and it'd be like Roots, if you remember that TV series or something, or intergenerational novels or something, the John Jakes, family sagas or something like that, then you're looking for these missing links. And it's John Quincy Adams. He's the son of John Adams, okay, and he's carrying forward some of John Adams's themes, like all men are created equal, but he also is a foundation for Lincoln through his son, CFA, Charles Francis Adams, who's going to be in Lincoln's inner circle. He's going to be ambassador to Britain. So, John Quincy Adams, yes, knew George Washington in the flesh, the only president to know both George Washington and Abe Lincoln. He names his first son George Washington Adams, and that's a lot of pressure on the son. And don't laugh, it doesn't end well. George Washington Adams dies of suicide, and oh, you can put too much pressure on a kid. I'm telling you.
Well, John Quincy Adams, John Adams put tons of pressure on this.
Yes,
letters to his son. I'm like, way to encourage your kid, Dad. I mean,
yes, and either you succeed or you die. Okay.
Yeah.
And many of the Adamses, it didn't. So John Quincy, knows George Washington, and when he collapses on the floor of the House of Representatives, Abe is 10 paces away. Abe is in that Congress and on the committee to make funeral arrangements. JQA is, yes, because I'm telling you, an intergenerational saga. He's so if you're into Wuthering Heights or something, like they're different. It's the intergenerational saga of the Heathcliffs and the Catherines and all the rest, and all the names repeat. Okay, so and that's true. John Adams and John Quincy Adams. So he is this really important character early in life because he has to be present because his parents have told him anything less, you're a failure. So that means he has to suck up to the South if you want to be president. But then he gets kicked out on his butt, just like his father. The two presidents early on were not reelected, and wow, that's humiliating.
Then he kind of finds himself.
He does
after that
and politically, he no longer has to kiss the Southern ring because he becomes a Northern congressperson.
Right.
So he just has to be popular in his Massachusetts district, and he becomes old man eloquent against slavery and the gag rule and all sorts of stuff. And he's getting closer to the end. He starts thinking about more and more. His maker. You can read he has 50 volumes of diaries. He starts it at age 8. He ends, in his 80s. He's pretty faithful every day, kind of writes something. It's all word searchable. It's the most self-documented life, perhaps, of any important political figure, maybe even in history. And so you can read the diaries and you can see how he's becoming kind of a little bit more spiritual. He sees the end is coming. What am I going to do with my last days on, this earth? I'm going to commit myself to the anti-slavery project, which he didn't do. When he's president, his vice president's John C. Calhoun from South Carolina.
Right. Well, again, he's almost a fifth character in the book, and I want to thank you because after I read this, I thought, okay, now I need to go on and read a biography.
And he wasn't supposed to be, but I just kind of did get absorbed by him, and no one had quite told the story that way. And the Adamses are obsessed with dying in just the right dramatic way.
Yeah.
And John actually, think about how hard it is. He's waiting 10 years just to die on July 4th. That's what but that's only the first half. And then to do it on the 4th and not the 5th or the 6th, without hemlock. Think about what astonishing force of will one must have to actually die on the day one wants to die on, and the day being actually the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Now, Thomas Jefferson probably had a little medical help. Adams did. So these Adamses, they're crazy people, just in their strength of will. The current occupant has, whether you agree with him or not, he has tremendous force of will. You must give him that. And I voted against him. But JQA has tremendous force of will, and the book will actually tell you a lot. I'm obsessed by the idea, by dynasties, but also how people die. It's hugely important in the American constitutional system. How many people die and wars.
And that gets to actually what you talked about earlier, the robust magazines and newspapers in the country at the time. There's beautiful pictures in the book, these gorgeous drawings, sketches of John Quincy Adams' unbelievable death, and the
deathbed,
Abraham Lincoln,
Charles Sumner, the deathbeds, yes,
very Christ-like, and so there's a lot in there.
And in volume 3, I'm going to have to tell you about JFK and RFK, the good one, and MLK, and that's dynasty. Okay, that's before your eyes, and in this book, I narrate the first time that someone gets fatally shot in the head in public before hundreds of people, and others using that for political purposes and trying to use the martyrdom. I tell you the first time that happened, and it's 1865.
We have a lot of law students from UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law watching, both in person and online. So I wonder, Akil, how would you like the next generation of lawyers to consider our constitutional history, because they all take con law? How would you like them to consider our constitutional history differently based on this book?
So I'm going to be really harsh and ornery and cranky. I'm 67 years old now.
You're permitted.
So the fundamental problem is the younger generation doesn't read books and doesn't read long books. My wife and I have 3 kids. 1 went to Georgetown, 2 went to Yale. They don't read books. Their friends don't read books. And it's a problem because if we don't, we die. Abe read books. Frederick Douglass read books. Elizabeth Cady Stanton read books. So did Harriet. So you can't write books without reading books. So the first thing that I would want that people, the students to do is, read the books. Because if they don't know our history. And there's maybe one book that some people in this generation have read, and I'll be very blunt with you. I don't think it's actually accurate and fair. The most prominent history book that this generation has been exposed to is a book by Howard Zinn. It's a people's history of America, and I think it's actually basically wrong. It won't tell you that the abolitionist project begins in America, and it won't quite tell you about Lincoln's greatness, how more people got to vote on the Constitution than had ever been allowed to vote on anything before in human history. I'll tell you the bad stuff. I'll tell you a lot about 3/5 Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause and other things. But Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon, he actually thinks Howard Zinn, and Howard Zinn in real life was his neighbor. He thinks Howard Zinn is great, and he kind of makes fun a little bit of Gordon Wood. And I think Gordon Wood is right and Howard Zinn is wrong.
There's a piece missing in this book that I think you said you were going to address in your next book, but somebody asks about it. I think you know where I'm going with this, Akil. Someone says, why were Indigenous people not included in the struggle for equality until very much later? And I know when you and I talked before tonight, you said that's something that you definitely want to address.
It's a big issue, and I'm going to be canceled by the hard left on this issue, but I agree. I believe in what I wrote. And I know this doesn't sound like an answer, but it is. In the middle of the book, there are 8 pages of color maps. Look at those color maps and the captions. You'll learn a lot. But what the question is, it's kind of half true. Tribes are not are kind of excluded, but not Native Americans. Okay, from the beginning, there was Dartmouth, Old Man Wheelock, and so the project is fundamentally, if you want to join the American project, you're allowed to, in general, if you're Native American. What Lincoln and others are skeptical of is really strong protection of tribes as such, especially strong tribal sovereignty. And here's why. Because if they're strongly sovereign, and they never were, yes, the American government made treaties with the tribes, but they were never allowed to make treaties with any other European nation. Okay? France can make a treaty with America, and it can make a treaty with Spain, and it can make a treaty with Britain. It can make the members of the Westphalian Club can make treaties with anyone. Native Americans were never that. Now, I'm pointing this out. I'm going to get canceled for it because people today don't want to hear this. But the tribes were able to make treaties with the United States, but not directly with the French or the Spanish or the Brits. And here's why. Because the Americans were afraid that the tribes might be able to ally with America's enemies.
Of course, right.
And so, so I'll tell you 2 stories. This is all true, but Howard Zinn isn't going to tell you this. So, the first Abraham Lincoln, for whom our Abe was named, was actually killed when he was planting in right by his cabin in what's now Kentucky, was then Western Virginia. He was killed by Indians from the wilderness who just shot him slew him by stealth. Now, I understand that they're being displaced, and so I'm not blaming them. I'm saying, wow, there was a lot of nastiness on both sides. And Abe knows who his namesake is and knows that story. And there were other people in his family. So here's what happens. His uncle Mordecai runs in and grabs a gun and shoots the Indian dead. And the Indian was hovering over the dead Abraham's body and was about to kill the son named Thomas, 8 years old, who would actually live and grow to be Abe's father. Now, Abe knows all of this, and he's not a hater. He actually and he signs up for the Black Hawk Indian War, and that's actually, he never kills anyone. A Native American wanders into camp, and he's not a combatant. He's a civilian. He actually has papers saying he's not a spy, and the other people in Abe's regiment say, let's kill him. And Abe is the captain. And Abe says, no, we can't do that. This person is just, and if you try to touch this person, you're going to have to kill me first. Oh, wow. So, yes, wow. So, but that story isn't told. It's complicated on both sides. Here's what you don't know. The last Confederate general to surrender was not Robert E. Lee. The last major Confederate general to surrender is, anyone know the name? Stand Watie. That's correct. He's a Cherokee, and he's the last one to surrender, and he's allied with the Confederacy, the main branch of the Cherokee, allied with the Confederacy. The Cherokee were not well treated by Jackson or others, so I understand why they're doing what they're doing, but it's complicated, and they practice slavery, do the Cherokee, even after the 13th Amendment, so it's complicated. Here's my answer to that question. America's Constitution does not exclude Native Americans when they say excluding Indians not taxed in the Constitution and the 14th Amendment. The exclusion is of tribal Indians who are in territorial enclaves. They're not fully sovereign, but they are threats to the American military project in a way it's not altogether different than how Confederate states wanting to secede can be threats.
Well, Akil, we could talk a lot longer, but I have one last question, and this comes from our audience, but I had the same question as well, so thank you to this person. Can you give us a little preview of Volume 3, the name, and just quickly what it's going to be about?
The name tentatively is Earth's Best Hope, which is a phrase of Lincoln's. We shall nobly win or meanly lose, the last best hope of Earth. And it's about how I think we remain the indispensable nation in the world. There are more democracies than there ever were because of the United States Constitutional Project. We're one of the first democracies, and we show, that it can work. And Howard Zinn doesn't tell you those things. He doesn't. His errors are all on one side. My errors are symmetric. This is what I want sometimes I make mistakes on the left and sometimes on the right. I'm just trying to get it right. And you won't, Earth's Best Hope, there are democracies in the world, and we're all struggling, including ours, and in India, and in Germany today, or Hungary, or Poland, Ukraine. We are, our project is so much harder because we bring together the great-grandchildren of all the other peoples on the earth. And that's not true of the French, or the German, or the Swiss, or the Norwegian, or the Indians in the Indian subcontinent. So it's a harder project because we're so multicultural and diverse. So in the final volume, I do think we're Earth's best hope. And we got to the moon, and we came in peace for all mankind. I actually believe that. Okay, I was 9 years old at the time. But in this story, there are 55 chapters rather than 17, 13 last book. The chapters are much shorter. Time is speeding up. I've got many, many more characters because all sorts of things are going on. And we keep fighting all these wars. And so there's the first Asian War and the second Asian War and the third Asian War and the fourth Asian War. And I understand why some of my fellow Americans would vote for Trump, and even including people who served their country, people like J.D. Vance, because one question is, what did we get for all these wars? So there are a lot of wars in the book. It's a lot more about foreign policy, a lot more characters. Oh, there are more assassinations, and I don't know how it ends because no one knows how it ends.
Is it also a constitutional treatment?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So you always have that lens.
Yeah, it's a attempted 3-volume constitutional saga. So I don't tell you as much about the light bulb or the flying machine. These are important parts of America. But I do very much admire America's technological innovation. I do talk about, for example, the automobile a lot, just very briefly, and Henry Ford, because here's why. The automobile is going to lead to the end of Prohibition, which is a constitutional story, because when the police come in to the speakeasy on one side, you can actually, in your getaway car, get away the other direction, and you can bring the booze in covered trucks in a way that would have been harder in wagons and all the rest. So there's that. The automobile story is going to lead to Al Capone and the end of Prohibition, but it's also going to lead to a sexual revolution. You see, because it's covered. So it's like a motel on wheels. Okay, so this is like where parking comes from, and you didn't quite have that with covered wagons and all the rest. So oh, yes, women's equality. Oh, the pill is going to be important, but so is the automobile. So I am going to tell you some of the technological stuff, just like, a life expectancy and child mortality, but it's a constitutional story.
Right, as it folds into
women's equality. Right. Women's equality actually is connected to sexual freedom, which is connected to actually automobiles.
Wow.
In interesting ways.
Well, please come back to New Hampshire.
Please invite me.
To tell us that story. It has just been so much fun having you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come join us here in the Granite State. It has been just an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Akil.
This has been a special presentation, The Remaking of America's Constitution, a conversation from the 2025 Annual Celebration of the Humanities.